Welcome back. Our former session broke off where the prosecutor Tertullus had completed his statement. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense." It seems there was a flurry of reaction to Tertullus' speech as his companions voiced their agreement with him. Paul addresses Felix with respect, recognizing his time as governor, but he offers no flattery. He knew Felix had not earned any gratitude from the Jews. "You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me." Paul begins by responding to the charge of stirring up riots in Jerusalem. First, he had no opportunity to do that in just 12 days. Several commentators count those days like this. Since his arrival in Caesarea, he could hardly have been rabble-rousing, not to mention the 4 last days in Jerusalem, when he was also under guard. Moreover, he had not spent those earlier days in making trouble, not even preaching in the city. James and the elders were at pains to discourage that with their advice to him to allay any suspicion on the part of the Jewish Christians there. So he had shown himself a pious Jew, sponsoring the 4 believers as they completed their vows. There had been no disturbance of any kind until the Jews attacked him in the temple precincts, and no one could prove otherwise. "But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man." Now Paul will respond to the second charge, that he was ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He avoids their term, affirming that he follows the way, and implying that it is not a sect at all, because they worship the God of Israel in full accordance with the law. He can say this in good conscience because Christians understand the true meaning of what Scripture prophesied, and so he is even more orthodox than other Jews. He does, however, share with most Jews the belief in a resurrection of all, and so, expecting to face God for judgment one day, he strives to be just in all he does. So much for the charge that the so-called Nazarenes are some criminal organization. Of course, their hatred for him stems from his preaching that Jesus, resurrected after they executed him, is Messiah, but they don't want to bring that into court. An obvious defense there would be to ask why they had killed an innocent man. "Now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation, should they have anything against me." One charge remained, trying to defile the temple. Rather than doing that, he says he had come on a mission of mercy and to worship at the temple. Both of these would be easy to prove, since the gift from the Gentiles was well known by now, and he had been 6 days in the temple precincts, paying expenses of the 4 who were completing a vow and purifying himself after prolonged time among the Gentiles. Now that the mob's hot blood had cooled, many would recall having seen him in those 6 days, a pious Jew showing his devotion. And then Paul pinpoints the worst weakness in the charge. Where are the witnesses to his impiety in the temple? Not the high priest and his followers here. They weren't there at the riot at all. The Jews from Asia who stirred the crowd against him would be the ideal witnesses, and they had disappeared. How then could that delegation in Caesarea prove their prime accusation? Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before this day. Here is something his accusers had witnessed, his conduct when he was brought before the Sanhedrin. Could they testify to any crime he perpetrated there? McGarvey focuses on this point. He challenges those who were present to state a single act of his that was wrong, unless it were the very heinous offense of declaring that he believed with the great mass of the Jews in the resurrection of the dead. The last point was made and presented in the ironical form which it bears, in order to show Felix that it was party jealousy which instigated his Sadducee prosecutors. To the Sadducees, here now before Felix, the resurrection was anathema. Affirming it before them in the council would be a crime in their eyes. Some crime. And Felix knew enough about Jewish beliefs to see how petty this was. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, "When Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case." Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. Roman practice left prisoners to depend on friends or family for whatever they needed. Here in Caesarea, Paul was blessed with many who loved him. Philip the evangelist had hosted him on his way to Jerusalem only weeks before, and the church that began with Cornelius and his family was undoubtedly eager to provide for the apostles' needs. But prison was still prison. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Here we will see one of the most dramatic confrontations between Paul and civil authorities. Why Felix called for Paul to hear him on the Christian faith is not at all clear. Some say it was at the request of Drusilla, being a Jewess, but this is one of many conjectures. What is not in question is the nature of this couple. Drusilla was a daughter of the Herod Agrippa who had executed James and tried to kill Peter, as we saw in chapter 12. He had pledged the girl to an Arab prince on condition that he convert, but he balked at circumcision, and the engagement was broken. Then she was married to King Azizus. But when Felix, who had heard of her remarkable beauty, saw her, he hired a magician to get her to abandon her husband and marry him. They were then, of course, in an adulterous relationship, and Paul had an opportunity to speak to them outside a court setting. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." Notice the thrust of Paul's message. He might have spoken as an expert on the beliefs of the way, since the couple had expressed a desire just to know those beliefs. But instead, he spoke on the most dangerous topics, considering his audience. And thus he spoke of the duty of all, and especially a judge, to practice righteousness. And he spoke of self-control, which neither of the couple exhibited. And then he spoke of the fate of all persons to face God in judgment. A fearless presentation like this shook even a hardened official like Felix, and he ended the audience abruptly. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. So greed won out over any pressure from his conscience. It may be that the mere mention Paul had made of bringing money for the poor in Jerusalem was enough for Felix to hope, session after session with him, that weariness of prison might make the prisoner offer a bribe. But the money was not Paul's, and anyway, he would not consider anything so sleazy as that. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Felix had good reason to bid for some goodwill with the Jews. There in Caesarea, Jews and Gentiles had long been at odds. Barclay recounts, there was an outbreak of mob violence in which the Jews came off best. Felix dispatched his troops to aid the Gentiles. Thousands of Jews were killed, and the troops, with Felix's consent and encouragement, sacked and looted the houses of the wealthiest Jews in the city. After this, keeping a man that the Jews hated in prison was a cheap way to curry their favor. But it would have taken a lot more than that to lessen their anger. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul, that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. Festus was quite a contrast to Felix, who had avoided doing anything else in Paul's case. 3 days after arriving, he goes to Jerusalem. Now, in effect, the province of Judea-Samaria had 2 capitals, a civil and administrative capital in Caesarea, and a spiritual capital in Jerusalem. Rather than settling down in comfort in the Rome-like accommodations of Caesarea, Festus heads to the spiritual capital, where the Jewish establishment are waiting to get Paul back into their hands. They'll try again for that attack on the road. But Festus doesn't take advice from priests on a court issue. He'll be back to Caesarea in a week or so, and they can come to him. and Festus knew the protocol, he would draw up the formal charge and state the latitude available to the judge who would be appointed for the trial itself. But as we shall see, determining the actual legal charge was difficult. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." It would have been fascinating to read a transcript of this occasion. A flurry of charges, no witnesses, no evidence presented, so that Paul could say flatly that he was innocent under both Jewish and Roman law. At this point, Festus ought to have released Paul and been done with it. But he was newly come to the province and did not want to start by angering the Jewish establishment. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to come up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" And so, a compromise. Still a trial before Festus, but on the Jews' home court. But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well." Paul subtly reminds Festus of his Roman citizenship, and then, oddly, says that Festus knows he is innocent. How could Paul say this to a newly arrived magistrate? I think the answer is in Luke's earlier statement. He had heard that blizzard of charges from the Jews and seen through them, and Paul could tell that he had. "If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." Seeing that he will not get justice in this setting, Paul exercises the right of every Roman citizen. He demands to be tried in Rome in the emperor's court. Well, here ends this session. There will be a delay before Paul is taken to Rome, and in that time he will finally stand before a Jewish king.